Most gardeners are designing their plots around the wrong pollinators, and it's quietly costing them yields every single season. Here's the mistake I see repeated constantly. Gardeners obsess over honeybees. They plant lavender in one corner, maybe a patch of borage, and then wonder why their squash still isn't setting fruit, why their tomato flowers keep dropping, and why their raised beds feel strangely quiet even on warm afternoons. The problem isn't a lack of effort. The problem is that they've been handed a single-species pollination strategy in a world that runs on biodiversity. Honeybees matter, absolutely, but if your entire garden is dependent on them showing up, you've built something fragile, and fragile gardens don't feed families consistently. A single established Sarcococca confusa or Sarcococca hookeriana var. Digina can attract and sustain pollinator activity equivalent to what you'd see around a productive honeybee hive during peak bloom. But it's doing this when hive populations are low, foraging is limited, and most gardens are offering nothing. You're not just feeding pollinators, you're training them to associate your garden as a reliable food source before your main crops even come out of dormancy. That behavioral conditioning carries forward into the entire growing season. To build on this timing advantage, I pair Sarcococca with a quality native wildflower pollinator seed mix that staggers bloom times from late spring through early fall. I'll link it in the description below. That combination, a structural winter-blooming shrub with a seasonal wildflower layer, is the closest thing to a full-spectrum pollinator strategy I've found for gardens under a quarter acre. How to actually establish sweetbox without wasting 2 seasons making avoidable mistakes. Most gardeners kill Sarcococca slowly by planting it in the wrong conditions, then blame the plant. It does not want full sun, especially in climates with dry summers. It performs best in partial to full shade with consistent moisture and soil that drains well but doesn't dry out completely. A slightly acidic pH in the 5.5 to 6.5 range is ideal. If you're planting into raised beds, mix your standard medium with about 20% extra compost and a handful of pine bark fines to acidify and improve drainage. For container growing, next to a hydroponic setup, a 10 to 15 gallon pot with good drainage works well. I've run one on a patio next to a small NFT lettuce system, and the early season insect traffic it generates is measurable and real. Spacing matters. If you're using sweetbox as a border along raised beds, plant shrubs about 3 feet apart. Within 2 to 3 seasons, they'll knit into a dense, weed-suppressing hedge that doubles as a pollinator anchor. Fertilize lightly. Pushing it with nitrogen-heavy feeds produces lush foliage at the expense of flower production. A slow-release balanced fertilizer in early spring and again in midsummer is more than enough. The goal is a steady, healthy plant, not a fast one. The industry's silence on this plant reflects a market that profits from complicated solutions to simple problems. Sarcococca doesn't require annual repurchasing. It's not a consumable. You buy 2 or 3 plants, get them established, and they work for decades with minimal inputs. That's not a profitable narrative for garden centers running on seasonal impulse purchases or for companies selling pollinator sprays and synthetic attractants. There's no active suppression campaign. The gardening industry isn't that organized, but there is a real economic incentive to keep your attention on annual products rather than permanent solutions. Beekeepers have been more honest about this plant than the ornamental horticulture world precisely because they track what their hives respond to. They notice when late winter foraging increases because someone nearby has a mature sweetbox hedge. If you ever get the chance to talk to a serious local beekeeper about winter forage plants, ask them specifically about Sarcococca. The response will tell you everything. A layered pollinator strategy only works when something anchors the winter end of the calendar. After Sarcococca finishes its peak bloom in late winter, You need a continuous succession of flowering plants carrying insect populations through the main growing season. A well-designed native wildflower pollinator seed mix handles exactly that. The best versions are calibrated to bloom in sequential waves from early spring ephemerals through summer composites into late-season asters and goldenrods. In my own 400-square-foot kitchen garden, Sarcococca runs as a permanent hedge along one edge, while the wildflower mix fills a dedicated 12-square-foot strip along the sunniest border. Between those two elements, the space sustains meaningful pollinator activity from January through November. Fruit set on cucumbers improved in the first year. Squash pollination, which had been inconsistent, became reliable. The system works because there's never a gap long enough for beneficial insects to look elsewhere. This is the kind of knowledge that used to take decades of trial and error, and it's exactly why sharing it matters. If this gave you something useful, a plant name you didn't have before, a clearer framework for pollinator timing, or a real reason to build that hedgerow you've been putting off, pass it on to someone who grows food seriously. Subscribe for more of this kind of thinking, where we skip the surface level and go straight to what actually performs across real seasons in real gardens. And as you build your pollinator calendar from Sarcococca through the full growing year, that native wildflower pollinator seed mix is the right next piece. Not a magic fix, but a natural extension of a system that, once it's running, genuinely changes what your garden is capable of.